Hey everyone, thanks for joining us this evening. We are so happy to see you all virtually for our second talkback session in our series of 5. I'm Tiffany Kelly. I'm the Director of Alumni and Family Relations. And again, very thrilled to have all of you join us tonight. I just wanted to remind you that we have uh, three other sessions. Yes, Talkback live sessions. We have a podcast series. If you haven't already watched the film, I hope you will. If you haven't already purchased the book, I hope you will do that. And also know that we have a commemorative poster and these fabulous t-shirts, show your love for the block plan. So anyway, thanks again for being engaged here with us. I'm going to turn it over to Steve Hayward.
Thanks, Tiffany. Thank you all for being here. I want to begin with a land acknowledgement and to say that we are coming to you from Colorado College in Colorado Springs, Colorado, within the unceded territory of the Ute people. The earliest documented people also include the Apache, Arapaho, Comanche, and Cheyenne. An extended list of tribes with a legacy of occupation in Colorado can be found on the Indigenous Community at CC webpage. Thank you all for being here. And what we're doing today is we're going to be talking a little bit about the sort of origins of the block plan and about most particularly the history of the block plan that Professor Susan Ashley has put together. I'm going to say more about the podcast and how today's session connects with that. But before we get there, let's start off just with a little bit of an exchange with Susan. And I wonder if I could ask you, Susan, now that the book is out and now that you've had a chance to hold it in your hands and look back really on the whole of the process, how does it feel? How do you reflect on this process now?
Well, I expected it to be interesting, but I don't think I anticipated it being as interesting as it is and was. It was a way of getting into a history that for the most part I had participated in. I arrived the year the block plan started. So I got here in partway through the story. And so I knew the people that I was reading about. I knew the people who had engineered the block plan. I knew the people who had implemented the block plan. I knew what it was like to live the block plan. And that's never been the case in any other thing I've done as an historian. And so, you forget, if you ever saw it, you forget how people wrote, you forget how they talked, you didn't know what they thought at a particular period of time. One thing that struck me about the people who are involved in this particular event today is how important they were to the college. I had really, you knew that they not only were important to the block plan, but you knew that they had many other roles at the college and had their voice in many other things. And I discovered that along the way. And I think I came away from it project admiring the people who created and implemented the block plan of a very great deal. One of the things that a student of the block plan commented on was that to do it here, there had to be an exceptional faculty. And I think I really learned that as I read, especially about the early stages, but also the later stages of the block plan. So.
You did hear with that. It's true that that's, and what we have a chance to do today is to talk to some of the faculty who were instrumental in the adopting of the plan. Now, Susan's book is available, and you can obtain it on the Block Plan 50th anniversary website. And there's also, of course, the film that you can access there. There's also a podcast there, and the episode that has come out today is one that's called Back to Benazet, which really looks back and tries to bring to life so that we can, or at least to let us hear the voices of some of the folks who were instrumental in the founding of the plan and the adoption of the plan, and who are no longer with us. And I wanted to sort of start off tonight, talking a little bit about, three in particular. One of whom was Louis Benezet, a former president of the college, and he arrives in 1955. Susan, would you characterize him as what's his connection? Now, as you know, before those of you who are just joining us, before in the backstage area, we were like discussing this, and Professor Shern, who you'll meet momentarily, said, Benezet wasn't there for, he was before. But what's the importance between Louis Benezet and the block plan? How would you draw that line?
I think there are two major connections. The first is that under Benezet, the faculty grew from about 50 to 90 faculty members. And most of those 40 faculty members he hired were young. And they were the major proponents of the block plan. And so they saw themselves as young Turks. They were inspired by Benezet's second effect on the block plan. He had a vision for the college. He told people they could be something more than a good regional college. They could aspire to be a nationally recognized college. And so those people he hired, I think, seized on that vision of what the college could be and lived in it and up to it. One curious thing I discovered about Benezet was the way he hired people. You would almost call it an anointing process. Someone interesting would come to his attention, and he would invite them to join the faculty. This is not the way it's done now, but there was a spontaneity and simplicity then, which would stagger anyone who arrived at CC at this moment. There were two things that people talked to me about when I arrived. One was Benezet, and the other was Dionysus.
As the play, and we'll come to the Dionysus play. Now, you mentioned the hiring practices of Louis Benezet. He arrives 1955. The college is at kind of a standstill, right? There, faculty salaries are very, very low. They haven't been moved in a long time, and as well, there's really not very many new buildings in 1955. This is like, and Louis Benezet comes in and really seeks to update both of those things. Among the figures that Benezet hires are a future president of the college, Lou Warner, an absolutely foundational figure in the history of Colorado College. Can you say a little bit about what makes Lou Warner such an interesting president of the college?
Well, Benezet hired Lou Warner as president. He said, Lou, you can just come upstairs, because at that point, Lou Warner was the dean of the college. And Lou preceded Benezet by many years. He was a graduate of the college, went off and got his PhD, and then came back as a faculty member, and then was in a circumstance of great urgency elevated to the deanship. That had an interesting repercussion. That was the situation in which Bill Hockman, many of you will remember Bill Hockman, arrived at the college. Lou Warner was an extraordinary person, down home type. I remember him for his socks. He wore crew socks always of many different colors, along with his suit. He drawled. He did not get to the point. You had to pay a lot of attention, because he talked around and through subjects, but he was an exceptional leader. He had a really great instinct for leadership. One of the things which impressed me about that, reading about the college, was that right after Kent State, when there was such an eruption of despair on the part of students, how he managed that particular situation was a genuinely exceptional tribute to his instincts. He was not a manager, he was a genuine leader.
We in sort of thinking about him as being the kind of college president that hadn't been existed before and would never really exist again. You know, if you sort of think about it, so Warner is an alum of the college as well. You know, he graduates as student body president, comes back as faculty member, he's dean of the college. You know, and so when he, at that moment when the block plan passes by a vote of the faculty by a majority, but that is not overwhelming, it is, he turns around and he says, you know, what do we do now? He's asking that as a former dean, a former faculty member, a former student body president, and an alum, all at the same time. And that's a really interesting combination. I wonder if we could invite in to give us a little bit of a reflection about Lou Warner, and particularly the way that he figures into this story. It's one of the stories that, as we were interviewing people, Susan, you know, including the three professors who we're going to be talking to today, is that Lou would, President Warner, that is, would invite people into his office and say something like, "What do you think we should do?" Which is a sort of, and I wonder if we can invite into the discussion here Professor Shern, who's with us, joining us from Colorado Springs, Colorado. Professor Shern, do you have a recollection of Lou Warner that you might be able to share with us? And did you have that kind of conversation with him?
Yes. I first met Lou Warner in Chicago. I had heard there might be a job opening at this little place at the foot of Pikes Peak called Colorado College. He was in Chicago for some meeting, some language meeting. I hooked up with him. I was shocked to see that he was staying in a very cheap, small hotel. And he had a copy of the Chicago Tribune, a conservative newspaper. I thought, uh-oh, maybe this is a wrong idea. But he quickly made me feel at ease. He learned that I went to a small college, that I was looking at small colleges. I was turning jobs down at big Eastern schools with big labs. And so he knew this. This is what really knocked me out. He knew the football scores of Colorado College versus Pomona College, where I'd been an undergraduate. So he knew all of this stuff. And then he wanted to know what he thought I should do if I were at the Colorado College. What would I do? And I had some definite ideas about small colleges, particularly Colorado College, and what it could do to make a more interesting and important contribution. So I could go on, and I can talk for a long time, man. I was trained to talk.
Oh, I know. It's one of the, joys of interviewing you, Don, is that I know, that you can get expensive. Now, just to sort of say where Professor Shern, where does he fit into this story?
You can call me Don. You don't have to call me Professor. I wanted to say just one thing. Benazet was very much like Warner in this regard. The first few days I was on campus, I had the job. He called me into his office, a little chit chat about the weather or some damn thing. And then he wanted to know what I thought. He said, "What should we do?" And I had some very definite ideas, which if we have enough time, a few more hours, I could go into those.
Yeah, that was actually the first time we met, Don. I said to you, I wanted to talk to you about the block plan, and you said, "I'll talk to you about the block plan, but first I have about 5 ideas that I think you should be implementing now at Colorado College, and we'll get to the block plan after I've rolled those out for you." So, yeah, one thing about your ideas is, one of the, when we sort of think about where, your particular, contribution into this story is that you famously and as we discovered in the process of doing the research, repeatedly said something along the lines of, give me 15 students and let me teach them. The idea of singleness of focus. Do you have a recollection of the multiplicity of times you said that, or where does that idea, come from?
I want to apologize to Susan and to you. I didn't say that at Murphy's Bar. That attributed to me. What I really said was, bartender, could you bring us another beer?
But it led to and it miraculously led to the block plan, Now, but one of the things that we found, and maybe I can get Susan to comment on this, is that there's this much mythologized moment of being in Murphy's where allegedly, well, Dawn said something along the lines of, give me 15 students and let me teach them. And one of the interesting things, Susan, that you found in your research was that there were a number of times when Dawn made that suggestion.
Yes, I think it was fresh on his mind because, Don, you remember you were chair of the academic program committee and you were setting up the agenda for the year. And you said, we're always talking about these procedural things. Let's reach a little bit higher. Let's talk about radical ways of changing the college. And you asked your fellow committee members to send you a list of the things they thought would really change CC in the world. And so there's a list of these lists, these ideas. And one of them is yours, and it's the block plan, basically. Teach one course at a time to a small group of students. But there were other interesting suggestions that never saw the light of day.
Yeah.
I want to if we could bring in Glenn Brooks here to the discussion. And one of the parts, just sort of there is Professor Brooks. How are you doing, Glenn? Can you hear us?
He needs to unmute his.
Push the
He's
button
got his
on the-
mute button on. Mhm.
He has to push the button. It says mute.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Glenn, in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, there's a button that says mute on your screen. Oh,
There you
there
go.
you are. You're there.
Did you
Yeah.
hear?
Got it.
But did my voice come through?
Yeah,
Yeah,
we can hear
you
you
got
fine.
Oh,
Yeah.
great.
You're
So
good.
I got unmuted. Okay. So, hello, everybody. I've been muted since this started, but now I guess I can be heard. Anyway, you asked me a question, Don. What was that?
I was wanting to, part of what we're doing today is remembering, some of the folks that were extremely important in the founding of the plan who are no longer with us. And I wonder if you could say something about Fred Sonderman and the way in which what I've heard, the story is something like, it was Sonderman who apparently said something to Lou Warner like, what we should do for this upcoming anniversary of the college is not just celebrate things, but not just celebrate the last 100 years, but do something about the next 100 years to change the college and get it ready for that. Can you say a little bit about Fred Sonderman and his role in this story?
Well, Fred was very influential in the lives of all of us here. And unfortunately, he's no longer with us. But Fred was a source of a great many ideas of possibility of doing various things. The block plan was not something he directly came up with, but I can certainly say that it was Fred's encouragement. He had talked to me just about the possibility of sharing or some kind of study, and the set the mood for many of us to proceed, not with what has happened in the past, but what was going to happen in the future. And that was the spirit of the occasion that led to the block plan.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. And thank you again, Professor Brooks, for being with us, and for venturing into this strange world of the Zoom to join us for this anniversary celebration.
This is my first Zoom ever.
This is first Zoom. I'd like to bring in now Professor Fuller, who was, in those in the discussions that discussion at Murphy's Bar. He was also there that day. Now, Professor Fuller, I know you've written a lot about leadership, a lot about institutional change, and I know that you had an amazing perspective on this. In one of the interviews I did, in sort of thinking about how things get done in the college, Professor Hockman compared the leadership styles of Benezet and Lou Warner to being quarterbacks, like the famous Army quarterbacks, Mr. Inside and Mr. Outside, both of whom had different philosophies about advancing the football up the field, one who would go around the outside, one who would go straight down the middle. I wonder if you could say a little bit about what CC was like in 1969. What was it about that time, about the place, that made this kind of institutional change possible?
Well, of course, that was a period in which a lot of things were happening in the country as a whole. When I started teaching at CC in 1965, and I see my colleague Owen Kramer there, he and I started on the same day, and we had offices next to each other, which we can talk about later. But when I started teaching at CC in 65, the atmosphere of the college was not all that different from the atmosphere that I had experienced as an undergraduate in the late 50s. And by 1968, of course, the whole country was in an enormous uproar over Vietnam, civil rights movement, and then later on the Kent State incident and so on. So you have to keep in mind that we were in the midst of a period in which changes of all sorts were taking place in the country. On the other hand, it was also a period of educational experimentation. Lots of colleges and universities were trying to do things differently. And there's something unique about CC's response to that, because most of the changes that occurred at that time in other places were things like dropping requirements, dropping language requirements, eliminating grades, or finding alternatives to letter grades. The 414 idea became very popular, and Colorado College actually briefly considered it and rejected it. What made us distinctive was that instead of tinkering with the content of the curriculum, we made a significant change in the format of the classroom. So I would say most of what was going on in the country at that time was changing the content and leaving the traditional classroom structure largely untouched. And what we did was the opposite. Instead of tinkering a lot with the curriculum itself, although we made some changes in it, we changed the format in which teachers and students interacted with each other. And I think that made us distinctive in a very significant way, and in many respects continues to make us distinctive in the context of higher education. With regard to Lou Warner, one of the things that I think is really important to say about him is that he was responsible for persuading the Board of Trustees to be willing to take the risk to do something that basically nobody else was doing. And he was very important in that respect, in addition to all the other things that people have said about him. He was a very traditional individual in many respects. Even in many respects, you could say kind of a conservative figure. But in this respect, he wasn't. He really was willing to do something which someone who's naturally by disposition conservative, you wouldn't necessarily expect to do. He was a combination of tradition and innovation, which I think has characterized Colorado College ever since, that we do things differently, but we also preserve the commitment to liberal learning. And I think that's a big, big part of what happened to us.
Yeah,
I think Don has something to say.
Well, I just got called. Somebody was at my door saying the lady had heard some signal that I was having trouble with Zoom, but now everything's just fine. So I assured the lady at my door that all was well.
Can I say something?
Sure, go ahead, Don.
One of the reasons I'm so proud to be at Colorado College is that we have people like Tim Fuller, so articulate, so thorough, so meaningful. So I just want to say I'm proud to be a colleague of Tim Fuller. Though he's wrong about determinism, he's right about a lot of stuff. And I really am so happy to have been a colleague.
I agree with that completely.
That feeling is mutual.
let's bring Professor Kramer into the discussion and welcome him in. And hello, Owen. Thanks for being here. And I know that you have. I wonder if I could ask you to say a little bit about Lou Warner and your recollection of that time and this process.
Well, I met Lou Warner first in Cutler Hall in his office. Tim and I came for interviews in the fall of 1964. And if you cast your minds back, that was the year when we had a little girl worried about atomic warfare and a existential election in the country. And Tim and I came, and I flew up from Austin, Texas, on a puddle jumper plane and got off it and was met by Ken Curran, the dean, and brought back to campus, where we could park a car in front of Cutler Hall in those days. Yeah, I got out, and Ken Curran turned me over to Glenn Gray, who took me to lunch and tried to find the Garden of the Gods afterwards from wherever we had lunch, which was odd. Glenn rode horses out there, but he couldn't get there from I-25. And we wandered around, but eventually I got back to campus, and eventually I met Lou Warner, and I was struck by the slowness of his speech. Don's good colleague used to be able to imitate that very well. Gil Johns. We will all recall Gil Johns's Lou Warner takeoff. But what I discovered was this was one of the sharpest. He and Ken Curran read everything that came out, and they could recommend books, and it was quite remarkable. They read stuff that I hadn't read and could put me onto good things to know. And I thought a college run by Lou Warner and Ken Curran is probably a good place to work. And I guess that Tim thought the same thing.
Absolutely.
Because we've both been here ever since.
Well, let me just say with regard to that Doug Mertz, who was the chair of the political science department at that time, and largely was responsible for building the department that exists today, he took me in to see Ken Curran, also in Cutler Hall, because in those days, the dean was on one floor of Cutler and the president was on the other. And I thought Curran would ask me about my field, and he didn't. The first thing he said to me, "Have you read The Natural?" The famous baseball novel by Bernard Malamud. And fortunately, I had. And so then he asked me if I'd read C.P. Snow, The Masters. And fortunately, I had. In fact, I said to him, I said, actually, I've read the whole Strangers and Brothers series, which is about 11 novels.
Yeah, he probably suspected that you had.
Well, I don't know how he knew that, but at the end of an hour and a half discussion of nothing but novels, fortunately, most of which I had some knowledge of, after I left, I said to Professor Mertz, I said, he never asked me anything about my discipline. And Mertz smiled and said, I don't think you should be worried about that.
Mhm.
One
I
of the
think
one of
not,
the
yeah.
things that's in terms of thinking about taking think about this moment of institutional change, it's some to frame it. It might be useful to have a little bit of data, and I wonder, Professor Ashley, if you would be able to say so, just to sort of talk about the timeline, and just to go back to something that Professor Fuller was saying, that there were a number of initiatives that were on the table at the time. One was a 4-1-4. Four in the fall semester you take 4 courses, in the spring semester you take 4 courses, and that, if that sounds to you like it's relatively uncontroversial now, that's because it was relatively uncontroversial then. It was being adopted in different, so, and that was turned back that was voted down. And then so much more moderate kind of changes were proposed, and then the block plan. In order to frame, that's one of the part of the frame. The other frame that comes across, and you can see this in both the documentary and in Professor Ashley's wonderful book, it has a lot of photographs in it. And one thing that you can't see these photographs of the figures on the screen here without being struck by their youthfulness. So let's say that the idea of Professor Brooks begins his study of the campus in 1968. How old, Professor Ashley, are these colleagues of ours at that time, just before the block plan comes in?
I tried to trace their birth dates in their 30s for the most part. There were a few older faculty members, such as Bill Hockman, who I think was put in a terrible position because he was displaced by these emerging young Turks. But then there evidently were the older faculty, the pre-Benezet faculty, who were a little bit more reluctant about change. So there must have been a sense of solidarity among these new arrivals who had clustered around Benezet, who had this vision of the college as being more than it was at the moment. But you're right. One of the things which struck me, which nobody had ever said anything about, was a major effort to take the college off the semester system, which turned out to be either a 3-3-3, a trimester system, or a 4-1-4. And it was roundly defeated. I think 2/3 of the faculty voted against it. And so how you would then, and the argument was you could never learn enough in a truncated period like that. And so then they embrace something which is much more intensive than what they were thinking about, what they defeated. So I think that probably going through that exercise of imagining a new way of teaching and defeating it was one of the things that opened the way to the next step, taking a slightly more radical step.
One of the so you sort of think about by the time that in terms of sort of thinking about what the timeline looks like. So it's October 1969 is when the faculty votes to approve and to implement the block plan. Before that, there's the summer of 1969, famous for the Bryan Adams song of the same name, in which Professor Brooks is putting together his 3 reports about things that can be, that might be considered in the college. You have the block plan. How does it work in terms of the curriculum? How does it work in terms of the facilities? And then it also has how does it work in terms of the leisure program? And I'm going to come back to you, Professor Kramer, to ask you a little bit more about that. But just before that summer, when Professor Brooks is putting together his 3 reports, what happens is there's a symposium at Colorado College. Now, this was an annual tradition at the college where it was themed around a particular thing. And if I recall, of course, I wasn't born at the time, but what I've heard is that the theme was violence that year.
Yes.
And what was one of the sort of the hallmarks of that symposium was a performance of a play. Richard Schechner came in with the Dionysus 69, and can you say a little bit? I'm assuming, I'm going to assume that most of you, if not all of you, were in attendance at that performance. Just sort of, I wonder if you could just offer some recollections of that performance. It was very controversial. And if you could say a little bit about why it was controversial, and then perhaps how might that have contributed to the coherence of the campus culture that would then pass the block plan? It's a long question, but maybe Dawn, you could say a little bit about that performance. Were you there that night?
No,
I was.
I was.
Okay, Tim, what do you recall, Tim? Can you tell us a little bit about why the performance was so controversial?
Well, for one very obvious reason. I mean, it was performed in the nude.
But they promised not to do that.
They had promised beforehand that it was known that they had done it that way in New York. And so the deal was that they could do it here, but they would use body stockings. And then, of course, and this is typical of the 60s, when they actually got to doing it, they welched on the deal and did it exactly in the way they did it in New York. And so all of a sudden, this whole audience, including a lot of community people, because Packard Hall was full.
No, Armstrong.
It wasn't just students and faculty, it was a lot of people
It
from the
was
community. And
Armstrong
all of
on
a
the
sudden,
stage.
all these naked men and women were cavorting on the stage. And
Climbing over the seats in Armstrong.
yes, and it was a participatory thing. So they would go out into the audience and so on. And of course, nobody in Colorado Springs had ever seen anything like that. So everybody was aghast. And there were,
Imagine on the old West Side, they had a few shows of that character in the
well, that might
gold
be
mining era.
probably most of the people in the audience that night were not frequenting those alternative scenes. So that was the biggest thing about it.
Right. So it created
And
a real controversy.
the college took a lot of heat. And this is another tribute to Lou Warner, by the way, is that faced with severe criticism from the community and from alumni, he absolutely stood staunchly in favor of academic freedom and defended everything, even though he disapproved of what had happened. He absolutely defended the college against the critique from outside. And it was a big moment.
What's
The
your
Board of
recollection?
Trustees was very upset about the public reaction to this.
Yeah.
And so Lou, who was very much a friend of Russell Tutt, the chair of the board, recounts a meeting in which the board had a motion to apologize to the community for what CC had allowed to have happen, and I think they wanted to force the resignation of the person who organized the symposium.
That was Ailey Boderman.
It was Ailey Boderman, right. And so the motion was there, and Russell Tutt said, you can approve this motion. And if you do, within 2 minutes, you will have 2 resignations on the table, mine and the president of your college. And they did not support the motion.
Yeah, Ailey had been the impresario of the symposium for several years. And but this was in one way his finest hour and his darkest hour.
Glenn, can you say a little bit about your recollection of Dionysus 69? Were you there that night? And can you say a little bit about how
I was there. I well remember not only the nudity, but it was in fact based on a Greek classic, and that in itself was substantively interesting. And I think the question of nudity passed away eventually, and then memories of the Greek play itself persisted. That's all.
The play is the Bacchae, which was Euripides' last play, which he put on in Macedonia after he had actually left Athens in disgust at the end of the Peloponnesian War. The translation used was William Arrowsmith's, and and I'm sure that if Lou knew about that, he knew Aerosmith, who was at Texas and was a mentor of mine, and sent his daughter to Colorado College. So Aerosmith would have a P number for Tiffany Kelly if he were still alive. The scene is the birth of Dionysus. Dionysus is the patron god of tragedy, and if anything was appropriate in 1969, it was a foundational performance of tragedy. And I wasn't there. I actually was doing childcare. My wife came to the performance. Schechner came back much later, and I remember discussing with him the production that he had put on here. He was a significant person. He edited what had been the Tulane Drama Review and became the Drama Review, TDR. And this company of actors was part of the operation of the Drama Review, which was the premier place for dramaturgy in that era. And this was, among other things, a scholarly, correct approach to classical Greek tragedy. So it was well that Colorado College actually did the whole thing. The next week, they all got arrested in Minneapolis doing the same production. But Colorado College, the only liberal arts college in its time zone, actually was able to produce this thing. It was the main stage in Armstrong Hall. There were probably more than 800 people there. There were people sitting backstage and in the projection booth and various places where overflow was accommodated for people who knew how to get into the doors. It was unfortunate that the doors to the main hall didn't open very easily for people like one of our stalwart city councilors, Betty Krause. People will remember her. And she was a good liberal and was offended by this production and tried to get out. It did cause distress, but then the theater has characteristically caused distress. And this was America in a very distressing time.
Right. So then, in sort of thinking about, what we have, this sort of town and gown divide, controversial moment. You have Glenn putting together his 3 reports, and then just to fast forward, late October 1969, the faculty gather in the basement of Loomis.
Mm-hmm.
And the vote it comes up to a vote about whether to pass the block plan or not. And the idea then, or to one version of the story, is that it's this controversial moment when the town is really criticizing the college, that really sort of brings the college together in some important kinds of ways to allow for this moment of the vote. I see that we have here joining us in a surprise panelist is Professor Grace. Professor Grace, are you able to join us? Are you video ready?
Well, I don't know. I've been trying to get in for the last 40 minutes. I've been hearing lots of what you've been saying, hearing and seeing.
I wonder if you were there, I believe, Professor Grace, for the vote. Do you have any recollection of any pivotal moment before the vote was taken that might have convinced people one way or another?
I remember the debate that went on for a set amount of time. I think it had been allocated 40 minutes for the debate or something like that. And there were some memorable statements made by those who were opposed. One, a history professor named Harvey Carter, who said every now and then you have to take this college by the tail, look it in the eye, and make tough decisions. And about 10 minutes later, a really iconic zoology professor, Doc Stabler, was in the back of the room, and he stood up and he said, "I say, let the Young Turks have their way." And us youngins were elated with that, because we thought this is gonna tip the vote, because Doc was a very forceful personality. And that's my recollection of the meeting. It was really quite exciting.
And do you remember, Dawn, showing up to that meeting? Were you pretty convinced that it was going to pass, or were you kind of thinking it could go either way?
Pardon?
You think about that meeting when the block plan was passed. Did you know it was going to pass, or were you thinking it could go either way?
I listened to Glenn Brooks, and I got the impression it would pass. I don't know whether he was just being theatrically agitated, but I think I believed him that it would likely to. Let me just take a minute. May I interrupt this train of thought? One of the main reasons, and it's been touched on, that the block plan was accepted, got started, was because of the culture. We learned a lot about the play and so on. There was clearly a national change in the culture. Question I want to ask is, what's the culture now? What might prompt a change? And let me just give you a couple of words. The culture now is virtual learning, online learning, remote learning. What could the college do? Are we just going to wait till the vaccines work, or are we going to take advantage of this? I think we should focus as a college on the future learning. Teach students to teach themselves. What are they going to look like in 5 or 10 years? Are they going to talk about the Bridge Club, the Garden Club, or are they going to talk about Beethoven? So I think we might do some thinking about how we can emphasize people after they've graduated 5 or 10 years down the road. How can we ensure that they stay alive intellectually? Let's return to what you were talking about before.
Glenn, what would you like to say about the meeting when the vote was taken? What's your recollection?
Well, I had had a number of conferences before the meeting with then the dean of the college, George Drake, and we had started counting some votes, and I think we had a pretty accurate prediction of how the pro and con vote was going to go, and that's about the way it turned out. So I was not terribly surprised, but I was happy to see that the plan had passed. Admittedly, that we really had not done much homework in preparing seriously for what was to come. So we then had, after the plan was approved and finally formally accepted, then we had to start thinking about what do we do now, and that was another whole phase of the program at Colorado College.
You know, just connecting that to what Don just said, 50 years is a long time for an experiment to succeed, and it has succeeded. And of course, I'm very devoted to it. But it is an interesting question how the circumstances we find ourselves in now will affect the next 50 years of the college. And if we stay true to the character of the institution, we will talk about that kind of issue in the future, I think.
I think so as well. One of the interesting things about this process is, just as we were kind of about tying up Susan's book, the pandemic hit. And one of the questions that we talked a lot about, Professor Ashley, was, as we came up into it, is like, to what extent was there room? And I want to take some questions from people in the audience today, but I wonder if you could reflect on the question that Professor Shern has posed here about, the block plan pandemic, but also the next 100 years, the next 50 years? What do you think if you were to look into the crystal ball?
I think it's very hard to look into the crystal ball. It's pretty murky. I think we'll adjust to COVID more readily than we can adjust to the impact of the internet and the infatuation with screens on the part of our students, the centrality of social media to their lives. And I think we've been reluctant to talk about it as a faculty and as a college, but I think that's one of the principal things with which we have to contend if we're committed to liberal learning. Will we be able to do it? Yes, I think that that it's possible that we really can confront what it is that we do. We might be able to ask the critical question that Glenn asked, which is how can we do what we do better? But it is a very different college and a very different world than the one that framed the block plan. And that's why I think it's so difficult to make predictions. There are many qualities which I think were essential to the development of the block plan and embracing that change, which don't exist now. And whether we could replicate those or develop other realities that would encourage us to embrace change, I really don't feel competent to comment. I have a measure of faith because it's in our tradition to embrace change and to think hard about what it is that we do. The block plan has really forced every faculty member to think on a daily basis of how it is that they're going to communicate. So we have the habit of reflecting about education, which I don't think is general. And that will help us. And we have some sort of identification with innovation, although that has become institutionalized to the point of extinguishing the creativity, which is at the heart of innovation. So I have some confidence, but it requires a kind of serendipity, which was essential to the block plan, along with leadership. And so it's just hard to predict.
Absolutely hard to predict. But I mean, for what it's worth, my perspective on it is that one of the things that the block plan does is it does put you in the habit of interrogating your practices, of asking exactly Professor Brooks' question, how can we do what we're doing better? And although I'm sure that there are people, faculty on the semester system who question the semester system, I don't think it's done with the kind of regularity or with the kind of rigor that it's done at Colorado College. I just want to, before we get to, I just want to acknowledge that in the one of the participants, immediately after the block plan is passed, in the basement of Lumens, there are students on the stairway who are waiting to hear about the outcome of the vote. And not one of those students, but back in the pub house at Colorado College, the staff and the writer, the editor of the Tiger, the publication, is waiting to hear about how that vote went. The students were very much, the block plan came about very much in collaboration with students. I just want to acknowledge that in the audience today is Professor Stephen Brooks, who was then the editor of the Tiger, who published a stirring editorial which bore the title "Commitment Time," which essentially said, "Okay, listen, we've got now. Everybody's got to get together and behind it and make this an all college." And so I just want to acknowledge that Professor Brooks is out there in the audience, and thank you for being there tonight. And we had a chance to talk about it. And I said to him, I said, hey, listen, you wrote this. And he said, well, send it to me. I'd like to see what I'd like to be reminded. And he said, I still agree with it. So a couple of...
Bravo. One other thing that happened probably in 1969, on the Board of Trustees, we had the publisher of the Oklahoman, E.K. Gaylord. And he was... a conservative sort of guy, and he didn't like what he was reading in the Tiger. And Lou Warner, God rest his soul, figured out a way of separating the student newspaper from college ownership and control. And that's why we have the Catalyst. And the journalism program, I see its director here on the screen. The journalism program benefited greatly from that independence. I would agree with Susan Ashley's assessment that times have changed. You used to be able to get here on the train. You could still buy a ticket on Amtrak, but it's bus from Denver or Raton. We had these puddle jumper planes that I arrived in, and Tim probably arrived in '65.
Yeah, Central Airlines.
Yeah, it was. Well, I came up on Braniff, which was known as the world's largest unscheduled airline, and was Texas at its unregulated best. And you know, we were isolated geographically, just far enough from other liberal arts colleges and the Ivy League to be able to operate independently.
Well, I
And
think another thing too, though, is the change in the attitude towards professional work and publication, which has dramatically changed from when Owen and I started to now. The professional ambitions of faculty and their commitment to scholarly work above and beyond what they do at the college is much more pronounced now than it was 50 years ago.
yeah,
And
The
that's
commitment to your
a
district.
matter we have had to continually adjust to, not only in recruitment, but in professional faculty support and so on throughout the 50 years. And I expect that will continue.
One of the good things about that shift towards professionalism is the students now are involved much more than they were in the old days. If you look at the publications, you'll see the senior editor, senior author is faculty, everybody else is a student.
Absolutely. And thank you for bringing up E.K. Gaylord. I want to just take, you know, however he felt about all this, I would like to mention that the funding for the film and for the book and the support of this commemorative projects, they are all provided by the Inasmuch Foundation. And so, you know, that is, thank you for reminding me to mention that. I want to get to some quick questions here. Mark Sushman asks about the variety of different classes that came in. When the block plan, people don't sometimes forget this, block plan comes in and it's a complicated, there's many 2-block, half block, you know, half courses, a complicated thing, different options for students to take. And the story that's sometimes told is that it's the 1-block, students have a strong preference for the 1-block class. Mark is interested to know about what the rest of you, is that your recollection that it's the 1-block class that then takes out those different other kinds of modes of delivery?
I think that one thing you have to consider is that the original form of the block plan was a 9-block year, in which the opportunity to take courses that were more than 1 block long was fairly substantial, and a number of multi-block courses were invented at that time: Renaissance culture, patterns in nature, and a number of other things. When we shifted to the 8-block year at the end of the 80s, in order to accommodate partly a reduction in the heavy teaching load for faculty, which is partly a reflection of the advance of professional work and so on.
Yeah.
The year became shorter and the number of multi-block courses began to decline as a result of that. So I'm sure Susan has done this, if you look at the number of multi-block courses before that change and then the number that occurred after it, the decline in the number of multi-block courses was quite significant. The other thing about the first year is that the blocks 1 and 9 were only 3 weeks long.
That's right.
And the middle 7 were 3.5 weeks. That was done partly to prevent an excessively long academic year. But very quickly, faculty complained that switching from 18 days to 15 days and back again actually in many ways increased the burden rather than decreased it. And so we eventually changed it to 9 3.5-week blocks, et cetera. So there have been changes over time in the system. The one thing that has never been changed is the spirit of the one course at a time part of it, and teaching one course at a time. That's the one thing that has always been preserved, even though a number of the things, Steve, you're referring to have been altered over time. The 10.5-week half block courses never really succeeded very well because we couldn't get enough courses that coordinated with each other in that way. And so the effort to do that, which was partly to accommodate the people who really wanted not to teach in a block system. I think legally it's still possible to do that, but there hasn't been nothing like that for probably
The psychology
40
department
years.
actually
What?
does a certain amount of that. They take 2 blocks and cut them horizontally instead of vertically, and it seems to work for them. So
My department chair was opposed to the block plan from the beginning. A lot of you will remember Albert C. And there was this half course option when the block plan first went in, where there was a 10.5 week or something, and you would take 2 courses. And Albert insisted that we were going to participate in that. He was opposed basically to the block plan. And so we got paired with organic chemistry. Or Introduction to Music was paired with organic chemistry. And if you're wondering what it was like to have time stolen from your course by another course, I taught Introduction to Music, and all the kids were taking that and organic chemistry. And,
I bet.
nothing competes with organic.
yeah.
We have a question in the chat about what proportion of the CC faculty leave after 1969 as a result of the plan being adopted. What is any of your recollection? Was there some people who left, or was your recollection of that?
As far as I know, very few left because of the block plan.
There was kind of trouble in the math department in the aftermath of the block plan. The arch opponent of the block plan, George Simmons, was a genius teacher in his calculus was sensational. Everybody loved it, and they learned calculus very well. But there were other people, there were wonderful teachers who could not manage to get their service math courses into blocks. And some of them just failed as block plan teachers of mathematics, not because they were bad teachers in general or bad people. They were wonderful people, but it didn't work. So math had to reform itself in a quite a large way.
Yeah, we tried to interview him, Simmons. We had a really hard time.
Some still around Colorado Springs that you could interview.
Yeah, we have a hard time getting him to.
Yeah, don't worry about it. It's okay.
And I remember Don saying, when I was trying to get in touch with him, and Don described his phone, which was like a really old. I don't know if you remember that, Don.
Mm-hmm.
What's that?
Anyways, so another question from the chat is about cost benefit analysis. Did you go in to the block plan? Did you pitch it in terms of here's the cost benefit analysis of the 414 model? Here's the block plan. Did you do that kind of an analysis? And it should be said that probably Professor Brooks will say the one question I think, Glenn, that you're asked most often about the block plan adoption is how did you convince the faculty to do more work, take on that much more? Can you say a little bit about that, Glenn?
Well, I challenge that as a proposition that everybody had to work more. Some people continued to do just what they had been doing in the semester system. Others perhaps worked harder. Some kicked back and took it easier. So I don't think there was a consistent pattern about that. I certainly heard that again and again, how hard it was. But in my own experience, I pretty much continued to teach as I had in the past. And I think a lot of us in this discussion didn't have a significant change in what we did day by day. And so I kind of challenged that as a proposition that everybody had to work so much harder.
Well, I think the 9 out of 9 teaching load was pretty demanding, but as was pointed out earlier, we were all young and eager, and we were willing to put up with things that maybe under other circumstances we might not have. From my point of view, it was not so much that I was working harder as that I was rearranging the way in which I was doing the work that I do. I mean, a 9-month academic year is a 9-month academic year. And so that's kind of how I looked at it. But of course, I was young and adventurous at that time.
And so maybe on that, we have just one comment that I want to read from the chat. It's from Lee Pomeroy, who says, "My heroes from 50 years ago, Don Sherman, Glenn Brooks, Tim Fuller, Owen Kramer. I took courses from the first 3, not from Professor Kramer, but I knew and admired them all, kind of like the lineup of the 1927 Yankees." And then adds on Michael Grace too, another 1927 Yankee. So that's high praise, high praise. And I want to thank you all for being here. I want to remind you that our next Talkback session is next Thursday. It's 5 p.m. You can find that on the 50th anniversary webpage. And we'll be talking to students both of the present and of the past. And we're going to be talking to students who are at Colorado College right now, graduates, alums from the recent future, and then some alums who were there and working in Professor Brooks' planning office. David Struthers, who actually had he was tasked with traveling around the campus and actually measuring everywhere where there could conceivably be a class held. So we'll hear from them and hear about that planning, the way in which the block plan came from the students, and then how it exists today for students. So I want to thank you all for joining us, and thank you all of our great distinguished panelists, the 1927 Yankees, indeed, including all of you who joined us, came up, as it were, as if in Dionysus from 69 from the audience and onto the stage, that kind of a great backache.
And then had to find their clothes afterwards, yes.
Thank you all, everybody.
Thank you.
I just enjoyed.
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Dawn. Thank you, Michael. Thanks, Owen.
Thank you, Steve, for hosting.
Thanks.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, when are you going to play that guitar?
The conversation at Murphy's Bar happened.
I see it.
It would have happened probably December, January, 68
So we're going to go out from a scene
69,
from the
but
movie,
this moment has really reached
in
the
which
level
we
of
went back to
legend.
Murphy's
All
Bar.
right, let's go. I think we go in through the back. Ready to do it. All right. Okay, go ahead.
If it had been 2 other people's I could think of, nothing would have happened. Nothing. I mean, it would have, I might as well have talked to the bartender.
It looks the same.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't know. Yeah.
I really think it was this meeting that got the block plan started.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, cheers to the block plan.
Cheers, welcome home. That's Bud Light.
Do you think it would have happened anyway had you not got together at Murphy's?
No, I don't think it would. The turning point was when Don said, what I really like, if I had my choice, would be to have a small group of students that I could work with intensively without interruption.
I like it better to listen to Don Shern talk about it and said, oh no, but this was the real moment.
You feel like this is the first time he said it, or was this a thing that you'd been saying for a while, and finally it was the right moment?
Well, I do remember we were going to Breckenridge to ski. We stopped the car to get out and relieve ourselves. And Glenn said, you know, Don, I think we could do this one course at a time.
But let me insert in that respect. We were all still teaching regular full schedules at the same time.
Right.
And I don't remember the specific roadside stops. I made a lot of roadside stops on the way up to ski.
And each time you got him to say to Don, I think we might do this.
Every time.
I mean, thinking from a music perspective, I think about it as being 4/4.
Well, so long, fellas. It's been fun to see you.
Yeah.
Thanks everyone for being part of this. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
And Michael, thanks for that. Thanks for being here. Thanks for joining us. I have to say, in terms of since the movie's come out, the scene that people love, they love the two scenes. They love the Murphy scene, but the scene that everyone talks is your scene about the tempo.
Yeah.
There's more going on.
I just thought they were through.
Yeah, we're through. All right. Thanks everybody. Let's go.
Bye.
Bye everyone.
Bye.